To stay up, she tried a trick she'd read about in a book. She drank several pints of tar-scented water just before bedtime. This was hard to keep from the pirates who drank nothing before bed besides their grog, rush, and whatever flasks they had hidden. The crew had made her a private bedroom below decks among the ship's stores, and to their credit, they hung there a very nice hammock and covered it with whatever they had passed for cushions. Hook even contributed a tiny fringed velvet pillow that looked more like a jellyfish than something fit for a bed. Wendy contemplated it now, wondering what hapless ship or manor that had been looted from them. She drifted off almost pleasantly in the gentle rocking hammock. It didn't seem like any time had passed at all when her eyes snapped open to utter darkness. The terrible, disturbing noises of a full ship of sleeping pirates came from the berths beneath her, snoring, tossing, turning, talking, or whining in their sleep, as well as far other unmentionable noises. Wendy tipped out of her hammock as quietly as she could, wincing at the creaks from the newly knotted ropes. Then she strapped on her leather satchel, now full of strange bits and bobs and pirate treasure, and climbed the ladder. The pirate noises reached a crescendo as she pulled herself up to the gun deck right behind their quarters. Her mind whirled through all possible scenarios of being caught. She expected a hand to clamp down on her shoulder at any moment her flight discovered. Although she tiptoed, it was probably unnecessary. The ship rattled and groaned like a haunted mansion as it rode the little nighttime waves. The plank she walked on didn't squeak at all. Shaking and trembling, she finally made main deck, where a great gulp of fresh air and an upside-down bowl of stars were a welcome relief. She studied the sky and finally managed to locate the Southern Cross, which was already fading in the false dawn. Funny that Neverland skies should be so similar to the real world, Wendy thought. Not London skies, of course, for rare was the night that one could see stars through the fog, and that particular constellation was, of course, absent from northern heavens. The mizzen mast rose like a great sentinel. She cast a wary eye up to the crow's nest, but it was empty. Perhaps the most dreadful pirates of the seas of Neverland didn't need to post a lookout for Royal Navy ships or potential foes. Still, the cockiness, or laziness, of it irked her sense of propriety. She edged up to the rail and looked down. Directly below her was the balcony that hung off the captain's quarters. While it wouldn't have surprised her at all to see the nearly inhuman Captain Hook awake and smoking his infernal cigars, pondering whatever sanity that it was kept him going, the balcony was blessedly empty. Far, far below, that was the Black Sea, little white tips of its baby waves playing in the starlight. "Quietly done, miss," came a voice from behind her. She spun around. It was Zane, but now he was shaking his head. "That is, I was impressed with your sneaking until it was obvious you had no idea it was here. You'll never survive Neverland if you're not on your guard." "Survive Neverland?" Wendy whispered indignantly. "It's a place of fantasy and imagination. I lived Neverland growing up. It's as much as mine as yours." "And how well do you know yourself then, I wonder?" the pirate said softly. "Anyhow, look." He pulled back a tarp that was lying on the deck, unnoticed among the tiny dregs and bits aboard a pirate vessel. A very tiny dinghy was revealed. It was more like a coracle children played with the seaside than a proper boat. Wendy tucked in her breath but didn't say anything. The pirate picked up the boat and gave it a surprising throw. It arched almost like a fishing line before dropping to the water with a very minute splash. It couldn't have been a large fish leaping from the water. Angelic blue phosphorescent dazzled for a moment in a ring around the boat before fading. "Down you go, lassie," Zane said, pointing to another rope tied to the railing. Wendy looked at the old frayed-looking rope in the sea below. But she was an English girl. She squared her shoulders, took a deep breath, and saluted the pirate. "Thank you, sir. I shall endeavor to repay your kindness some day." "Nobody salutes on a pirate ship," he said with disgust. "We're all equals here, except for the captain. More than anyone else in the world, I might add. You should think about that some, missy. Off you go, then." He hoisted her over the railing, making sure her hands were tight around the rope. Then he let go. Aside from antics in the nursery and some games when she had gone to school, Wendy's physical activity had been limited to bracing constitutionals around the park. Fast walks, in other words. Barring a few morning sketches, her arm strength was delimited by chores. She was terrified. But she closed her eyes, wrapped her feet around the rope, and slid. What it must have looked like from a distance. A tiny, pale girl slipping down from a thin rope from a galleon that floated silently on the midnight sea. Her light blue dress ballooned around her like a paper lantern lit from beneath. Yet it was not without a certain amount of grace that she made her way to the icy waters below. Zane had finished the dinghy as close to the ship as possible, so only half of Wendy's skirts got wet as she obviously transferred to the tiny boat. The equally tiny paddle was hooked in just under the hole, as neat as a child's play set. She once waved to the figure on the ship high above her. Whether he waved back or he was still there was all impossible to tell against the blackness of the sky. Wendy gritted her teeth, settled herself on her knees, and began to row. This was the point where, if she were telling the story to Michael and John, she would say something like this. And so the hero struggled, and growing weak, a glittering of sheen of cold perspiration covering her brow. She felt faint. In the east, rosy-fingered dawn was just brushing the sky, but all else was black. The black vault of heavens above her, the black sea around her, the black distant shore, the tiny thousand slimy things that lived in the murky waters below and occasionally brushed the boat with their black fins. Countless hours passed. It was all she could do to keep her eyes fixed on the shore and her strength on the paddle. The terror of being captured and the need to escape drove her through the harrowing gauntlet of exhaustion and fear. Wearily, but triumphantly, she passed through the other side. Though the task seemed endless, nevertheless she persisted. But the real Wendy was growing weak and utterly fatigued. The whole thing seemed less heroic and more like a scene from a farce. She was paddling a prop boat, conveniently dipping her oar on one side or the other, frantically and ceaseless, making no headway along the silken scrim. Above where the world would eventually rise, a few decorative clouds swept tentatively past. Sleek, long, thin, and dark purple, unlike London's clouds, the air itself was somehow light and glowing a sort of pale green. Was time finally passing? Was she actually making headway? At first, Wendy thought she was hallucinating, delirious with exhaustion, but the shoreline did seem closer. When she let herself turn around once or twice in fear, straightening her neck, the pirate ship seemed a little farther away. After a time, Wendy looked down and saw that the sea was only a couple feet deep and as clear as drinking water. Despite 1,000 different ingrained rules telling her no, don't get your feet wet, you will catch a cold, don't ruin your skirts in the salt water, don't get your clothes wet because they will also become see-through, our hero was fed up with the boat. She slipped her boots off and tried laces around her neck. She carefully undid her stockings and did the same with these. Then, holding up her skirt, she stepped into the water. It wasn't cold at all. She felt like an idiot standing there in such a lovely current, skirts raised like some sort of faint milk sop from a terrible operetta. So she let them drop and strode into shore. pushing against the water. Little fish she could see scooted out of her path. The sun pushed its way through the purple clouds. Its light grew on the beach strangely and organically, starting out weak and white, and then being strong and yellow. Wendy cast a final glance back. The ship, she, the only two tall things in an endless flat pane of water and shore, seemed to regard to each other in wonder. Then she turned from it and stepped onto land. The dry rattle of coconut palms swaying in the distance filled the air when the sound of the ocean began to recede. Wendy had arrived in Neverland. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.